This is a 1967 Becker Mexico TR radio out of a 250 SL Mercedes, which is period correct for the 250 SL. A good acquaintance of mine in California sent this to me for repair. I didn't know much about it. The fellow's name is Oz, and when Oz sent it to me, I didn't know much about it. So when I got it here, I hooked it up, and it works. I mean, not well. You had to turn the volume all the way up, and you could just barely hear something. So we're going to repair it, and I'm going to record the subsequent videos of making repairs and testing and so forth. The Mexico TR was the top of the line radio from Becker at the time, along with the Grand Prix TR. In the US, you could get a Grand Prix TR, a Mexico TR, you could get a Europa TR, and in Europe you could get a Monte Carlo TR, a Le Mans TR, I believe. Those other two, the Monte Carlo and the Le Mans, they did not have AM or FM on them. They were only long wave, short wave, and or long wave and AM only radios, so they wouldn't have been useful in the US. That's why we didn't get them. This particular radio, well, let me back up. If you didn't want a Becker radio, Mercedes came with Beckers, point blank. But if you did not want a Becker radio, you could order the car without a radio and subsequently have installed a Grundig radio, a Blaupunkt, a Philips if you lived in like Australia or South Africa. Those were big areas for Philips brand radios. And you could even get a Telefunken radio if you wanted. And most of those are names that the US was not even aware of in the mid-60s, past someone like myself, some radio nerd that knows them all, or thinks he does. But this particular radio is a European version, not so much in that it was made in Europe, because it was, but because it's a 4-band radio. By that I mean we have 4 bands: L, B, C, S, W, FM, long wave broadcast, which is AM, short wave, and FM. And I'll explain about this button here later that looks like it has a Q on it. So most radios had presets, meaning you push one of these buttons and the little orange pointer would move to where you had that station preset at. But the Mexico did not. These early Mexicos did not have presets. These buttons down here are only for bandwidth selection. So if you want FM, you put FM, and you would manually tune to the station you wanted, or you could push what you could consider the easy button up here. These are self-seeking models. The Grand Prix and the Mexico were self-seeking. You could push this button up here, and the little orange pointer would automatically move until a radio station was found, and it would stop. If you didn't like that station, you'd move on. You'd push this again, and it would seek until it found another radio station. And when it reached the end, it would automatically return back to the beginning and start seeking, self-seeking again. And it would do this for all 4 bands. Now, if this were a US Mexico TR, we would have 3 BC buttons, or AM buttons, and 2 FM buttons. But since it's a 4-band radio, this one's going to have more than that, obviously. We didn't have long wave. If we did, it was experimental or amateur radio. shortwave was pretty common, but it was for ham operators and truck drivers. But over in Europe, longwave and shortwave were much as big of a deal there as AM and FM was here in the U.S. Sorry about my phone going off. So, when you push the self-seek button, it would do this. Watch the little orange needle. You would push it, and the orange needle would move all by itself, like that. And you hear that click? That's a little switch that was switched inside the radio. And when power is applied and that switch is hit that you just heard, it would automatically return the tuner back to the beginning, and it would start self-seeking again. Like that. There's a little relay up here, right here, that's pretty involved relay. It's got 6 sets of points in it, and it does lots of things at one time. We'll get into that later because there is some damage to this relay. There's plastic standoffs between the points, and they look like ignition points in an ignition distributor. There are some plastic standoffs between the points that are melted. We're going to get into that later. As you can see, I've removed the top cover to show you just that. And you can see these are your tuning capacitors, and they're ferrite core tuning capacitors, which is a good sign of a well-built radio. So, on to the other functions. Obviously, this would be your volume and on-off switch. And for those of you that have these early TR model radios, try to limit turning the radio knob on and off. You hear it click, on, off, on, off. Try to limit turning that switch off. When you turn your car off, just turn it all the way down and turn your car off. I've noticed these switches are going bad in a lot of these TR model radios, and once they go bad, you can't get another one unless you buy a whole other radio just for the switch, and there's no guarantee that one will be any good. That's just a suggestion. The radio being on for long periods of time won't hurt it if it's been gone through. Obviously, this is your tuner knob if you want to manually tune it. This little knob behind the volume knob is your tone button. It controls how much bass or treble the speaker has in it. You have 3 positions: all treble, in the middle, and no treble and lots of bass. This one over here is your sensitivity. So the reason you would flip that to sensitive or not sensitive is if you're way out in the country in a rural area where there aren't a lot of radio stations, you want the radio to be able to pick up anything it can pick up on when it self-seeks. So you would make the sensitivity extremely sensitive. Conversely, if you were in downtown New York City or Atlanta where there are a lot of radio stations, the radio will pick up radio stations that aren't perfectly clear to listen to. So you would decrease the sensitivity to only pick up stations that had a good reception, good reception. The TR nomenclature that started in like late 64, 65, somewhere in 65. Up to that point, all Beckers were vacuum tube operated or powered. And I've got a vacuum tube over here, so here we go. This is actually a Telefunken vacuum tube out of another Becker radio. They would have 5 tubes in them throughout the top of it, and they were much bigger to accommodate these, obviously. So The tube models, a lot of them in the early 60s were labeled like Mexico TG. The TG stood for something that I'm not aware of. I know vacuum tube in German, they referred to them as valves, and they called them Ruhen. They would call the vacuum tube radio a Ruhen radio. That's RH umlaut O REN, I believe. Ruhen radio, valve radio. So I don't know what the TG would mean in the vacuum tube operated Mexicos. And before the TG nomenclature, they didn't even have that nomenclature TG, because everything was vacuum tube operated. Well, after even starting in the late 50s, even though they were vacuum tube powered, they did have transistors in them in a few locations, but they weren't used for sound output. They were used for other purposes. But when they went fully transistorized, where there were no vacuum tubes at all, everything was transistorized, is when they started using the TR nomenclature. It lasted about 3 years, and then after everything became transistorized, they just did away with the TR nomenclature and just started saying Mexico, Grand Prix, Europa. And then in '69, when stereo came out, they didn't designate them. They didn't put stereo on these black bars until a year or two after stereo came out. So then you started seeing Mexico stereo, Europa 2 stereo. So there's quite a bit of evolution in Becker. Beckers are a well-built radio. They have a resiliency a lot of other radios have not. They're tough radios. They're well-built. They are a pain to work on. I won't deny that. But if you have a working knowledge of electronics and radios, and you have literature such as this on the radios, it's not bad. You can go through, and if you can read a schematic, I know that might look scary to a lot of people, but it's not. It's very laid out. It's very organized. There is a method to all this madness. And if you know what all these symbols mean, you can read any diagram in the world. The rest of the paperwork tells you what each component is on each printed circuit board. I love these early printed circuit boards and these early Beckers. They're good quality circuit boards, and they're thick, and they don't, when you go to desolder something, you don't delaminate any of the copper traces. They're well built printed circuit boards. On the earlier I mentioned about this button that looks like it has a Q on it. Well, that's not a Q. And I'll confirm this later when we go over the schematics. That Q, when you push it, it allows for the entrance of an auxiliary input signal. Now, originally, this was meant for a turntable. Yes, you heard me right, a record player, a turntable, a 45 RPM turntable that Becker had come out with. They were trying to keep up with what GM had done in the late 50s and early 60s when they came out with their own 45 RPM turntable to put in cars. As you might imagine, that didn't go over too well. The first bump you went over, the record would skip. It was very gimmicky, but it was neat too. If you ever find a Becker turntable, hang on to it for dear life, because people will try to steal it from you. So now, all these years later, we can use this Q button as an input for a wireless Bluetooth adapter, or a a cord you plug into your phone. And if you turn it on the back, you'll see a plug right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pin round DIN plug. This is where you would plug in the record player, or you could also use this as a tape recorder if you wanted to record a program that came over the air on the radio, or record music. Becker had their own tape recorders as well, as did Blaupunk and Telefunken, and Grundig for that matter. So, but for now, in 2020, we can use this as a wireless Bluetooth input, or any auxiliary input for your music device. So that's what Oz wants to do. The Bluetooth is rather expensive. He's opted for the auxiliary cable, so we're going to order one that plugs in here, and it'll plug directly into your phone up at the top there where your 3.5mm jack is. Now, here's a problem. New phones are starting to come without the 3.5mm jack in them. So at some point, everything's going to have to go wireless Bluetooth, and I hate that, because the wireless Bluetooth setup is wonderful, because you can get into your car and you can connect your phone with a 50-year-old radio wirelessly, and that's just the neatest thing ever. But the Bluetooth, there is some sound quality lost, but in the wireless aspect of it. It may not be noticeable to everyone, but I was born into a musical family. I am musically inclined, and I pick up on stuff like that, and it's disappointing. So let me go over the rest of these stuff on the back here. We went over what that plug is for. That's for your auxiliary input. This is your antenna, where you plug in your antenna wire. This is just a mounting point for exterior bracketry. It's probably a 6 by 1.25 bolt that goes in there. The 110, 111 cars would have used this. And when I say 110, 111, I'm referring to chassis and Mercedes fintail models. This one right here is an interesting plug. This is for a remote control. Being that this is a Mexico TR, both the Mexico and the Grand Prix would have had this plug in the back. Maybe some of the Europa TRs did as well, I'm not sure. But being that this is a Mexico, it's a high-end model. These were used in W109s and 600s and high-end Mercedes automobiles of the time. And especially in the 600, maybe the passengers riding in the rear, they wanted to be able to control the radio from the back seat. So Becker came up with a device that mounted, if the 600 had a divider window, this separate unit would mount on the divider window wall. If it did not have a divider window, they mounted the remote control assembly either on the back of one of the front seats or on one of the B-pillars. And that remote control had a wire that would run up to the back of the radio and plug into this. And the rear passenger could control the radio from the back seat. They could turn it off and on, and they could adjust the volume and the tuning and everything. They had full control of the radio from the back seat. So that's what that plug is for. And as later on when we go over the schematic, I'll point that out to you, because it does have pictures of what all the plugs connections are and how they're labeled and what they're for. These early units are a two-piece unit. You have a separate amplifier we call this an amplifier, and it is, but it's also a power transformer for the radio. So you have your output transformer for the speakers that works in unison with these two output transistors here. Those are AD150 PNP output transistors. And then you have your power transformer. You'll notice this little card back here. It looks like a little card. It's a phenolic card with a printed circuit board on it that actually pulls out. Let me pull it out for you. It's like a little card. And see, it's got a very simple printed circuit on it. On some models, you could flip this over and you could operate the radio on 6 volts. It would have a different printed circuit for the 6 volt side. This card is only 12 volts. So that's why on the information, the schematic here, you see it says 6 backstroke 12 volts. Because some of the Mexico TRs did have a card you could flip over and make it operate on 6 volts. Some of the I don't know what would have operated on 6 volts in the mid-60s. I mean, I know the Americans got away with that back in the late 50s, maybe early 60s, but I don't know about European cars. If somebody knows, comment. That'd be interesting to know which European cars maintained a 6-volt system in 1967. So the unit is fused. There's a glass fuse right here. I have already replaced all of the electrolytic capacitors in the amplifier. As you can see down in there, you see the new black electrolytic capacitors. Here are the old ones over here. There's a pile of them. And I'll mention this later, but in a 50-plus year old radio, you always replace the electrolytic capacitors, even if they're good, because, you know, they're old, they're past their life expectancy, and they're cheap, and it's cheap insurance. And I will repeat that later on. It's important. You know, a lot of people have an original Becker radio, and it works, and they think it sounds good, but you put new electrolytics in, it wakes it back up, and it sounds even better. And a lot of people are surprised. You know, I also restore vintage televisions and European tabletop radios as a hobby, and same thing with those. The electrolytics are always the first thing I replace, because in old TVs and radios, they're always cooked. They got a lot of use back in the day. People listened to radio a lot more a long time ago. But anyway, the radio connects to the amplifier with this cord. Some people refer to it as an umbilical cord, but it's just a multi-pin DIN plug. It plugs in, and then this is your ground wire, and there's a little clip that holds the plug in, which has since fallen out. I'm going to have to put that back in later. An interesting note that I want to point out also is on this amplifier. You will see, I hope you can see it, this is where your speaker connections are. You'll notice on these two holes there's a number 5 in between. And between this two holes and these two holes, there's a 2.5. So let me shine some light on that so you can see that. You can see 5 on the 2 bottom holes and 2.5 between the 2 vertical holes. Okay, that is the output rating. It can, it can handle 5. I don't know if it's the output wattage or the ohms capability for the speaker. I forget. Somebody let me know. I should know that. That's horrible. Ah, well. I know I knew it at one time, so I'm not that dumb. Generally, the cars, an SL, a Pagoda, would have only had one speaker in the dash. But they would also use these radios in 108s and 109s and 600s and Fintail sedans. And in those cars, it was an option. You could get a rear speaker mounted in the parcel shelf under the rear glass. Or you could get 2. If you did that, you had to split the output. So if you have one speaker in the dash, you would plug your speaker wire into here. Somewhere over here, I had a speaker wire. I'd like to, well, must have gone away with the dodo bird. Well, the plug would plug in here for one speaker. But if you wanted to run a front speaker and a rear speaker, you would plug the front speaker in here and the rear speaker in here. So you could split the output. You had to maintain, obviously 2.5 is half of 5, so hopefully that math makes sense to you. You wanted to maintain an equal split in the output, because if you don't, you can create an impedance mismatch, which can cause these output transistors to run really hot. And they can probably handle it, but 50 years later, these are germanium transistors. You just can't go buy these anymore. I've lucked out over the last 10 years. I've stocked up on quite a bit of them, but I can't find any more now. Even the ones I did buy, I found in Europe, and I had to wait weeks and months on them to get here. So I'm stockpiled up, but you don't want to take, 50 years later, don't risk ruining them. They'll last a very long time if you keep them cool. Obviously, you see they're mounted to this thick aluminum rear housing. They do get hot in normal use, and they use this rear aluminum housing as a heat sink to disperse heat away from them so they don't overheat. And that's why this shield is over them, so nothing will touch them and burn. Now, below the speaker plugs is this little black plug here. See if I can pull it out. It's just a black plastic dummy plug. This is where you would put wires in if you had an electric antenna. I don't think Oz's car has an electric antenna, but if he wanted to put one in his Pagoda, he could run a wire in either one of those holes, and there's a slug screw in there, a set screw you would tighten down with the screwdriver, and it would pinch the wire that you put in there. And that is the 12-volt source for the electric antenna. You probably can't see it, but on the back of these little dummy plugs, there's a positive sign on each plug. And if you only needed to use one 12-volt power source, you would tear this plug in half and plug the hole that wasn't used to keep anything from touching it that might ground out and cause a dead short. Becker was pretty, they thought ahead quite a bit. I'm glad they did, because, that's very convenient. If the, let's see, I think the Grand Prix and the Mexico used the same amplifier. The Europa used a different one. So you can interchange them, but if you do, it'll be very weak sounding. It won't work well. Now, I've seen people do that with later Becker radios, like from 69 up. And the same thing, it works, but it's weak and it doesn't sound good. So you need to make sure you know what amplifier you have and what it goes with. We also have a on the schematic, it'll show you that if you have a schematic for like a Europa TR and a Grand Prix or Mexico TR, you'll note that the schematic for the amplifier section is different. And if it's different, I mean, that should be a red flag for you. Hey, this might not work. So, but that is the introduction for this radio that we're going to repair. And I'm looking forward to getting into this. It's going to be interesting. There's a solenoid that returns this tuner. After it reaches the end, it pulls it back. The wire going to it is burned. I don't know if you can see that, but the insulation has like burned off of the wire. I mean, something's dead shorted. There's smoke damage in there and everything. It's going to be an interesting repair. So, onward we go. And when I get this apart, I will just, I will come back to the video and report my first findings and or repair. Oz should be very pleased when this is done, because it'll work wonderfully. I've already tested the amplifier that I replaced the electrolytics in. The radio, it's no longer quiet. It woke up, it's loud, it's clear, it sounds beautiful, so I know this works now. I guess in the end, since we live in the US, I will check the alignment only on AM and FM. Of course, if Oz wants me to check the alignment on shortwave for whatever reason, I will. But when we do that, we'll use this. It tells you what signal you need to put in and what slug you need to tune. And it's got pictures of where the slugs are up here on top. I have to drag out my frequency generator. I don't know. That's not what it's called. I'm tired. When I get to it, well, I'll use the correct name. So these are our alignment instructions. Yeah, it's all in German, but that doesn't scare me. Even though I took a lot of German in school, I've forgotten a lot. I also want to give credit to a fella on the Pagoda forum, Mr. Fat Boy. He's the one that alerted all of us to these letters that denote when the radio was made. I had a list of this years ago. When I moved, I lost it. I thought I'd never find another one. And then Mr. Fat Boy posted again, and I'm like, yay, I found this list again. So, we need to give Mr. Fat Boy credit. I don't know his real name. Even if I did, I wouldn't expose him on YouTube. But that's his handle on there. Very knowledgeable fella. I love conversing with him. He's quite a character. Oz is too. This is Oz's radio. So I'm looking forward to getting into this, and I will return with, when you see this radio again, it will be apart and it'll look like a bomb went off in it, but that's what it takes. And we will be getting into a lot of small intricate things that I'd venture to say most radio repair shops wouldn't do, because either they can't be bothered or they don't have the capability or the knowledge. But we here in my kitchen have. So We're going to show them up. So, until next time.